Hello and welcome. During this week's video we are going to be talking about an event for the very first time on this channel. This event would send Europe into the harsh realities of war as nations, kings, nobles and peasants were forced to play the very real, very brutal and very deadly Game of Thrones. This is part 1 of the 100 Years' War, the history of England and France. Now while you're here, please consider liking, commenting and subscribing and also hitting that notification bell. Thank you very much. Now the name is the 100 Years' War, but the event actually lasted for 116 years. The name 100 Years' War is just easier to say, it rolls off the tongue. It would see the birth of the Black Prince, the gallant French knights shining in armor, the echelons of chivalry, famous battles of Crevy, Poitiers and Agincourt, the entrance of Joan of Arc and the utter brutality, the death of thousands, the decimations and desperation of people, the horrific last dance of the Middle Ages. Now, the 100 Years' War was nation against nation battle tactics, the harsh murder of thousands, but it was also the event that defined a backwater country that would eventually come to rule most of the globe, England. It would gain its role in the world, its understanding of its people, and amazingly, its language through this war. Now the official start is actually 24th of May 1337, but to understand our protagonists better we need to understand their backstory, otherwise nothing makes sense. So we have two royal houses, the English Plantagenets and the French Valois dynasty. Now for centuries these two houses had been fighting over the European land of France. Remember that it wasn't like modern day France, it wasn't the modern day boundaries that we have. These lands were the personal property of the king or the queen and their nobles. Therefore, they could be fought over and they could be bought. So to start off, we need to start with someone called William the Bastard. He was a French noble, a guy called the Duke of Normandy, and he looked back at the conquering ideals of his great-great-grandfather Rollo, who was a Viking, and he made the very most of a distant claim to the English throne. So he sailed across the English Channel with his army, and in 1066 he had the Battle of Hastings, and he won. And then he was known as William the Conqueror. He was the first king of a united England. He ousted all of the old Anglo-Saxons and the remaining Vikings. He was the first English king. Here, England became William's personal property. Now, he was the first English king, but he was born in France. He held a French title. He had lands in France. He spoke French. It was the language of the nobles across England, it was the language of literature, and it was the language of the king's court. Well, English, on the other hand, was the dirty language of the peasants and the serfs. If you fast forward until 1155, you get a person called Henry II becoming King of England, and he came from Agincourt in France. So we can see even more French lands being added to the English crown here. Now then, Henry decided to marry someone called Eleanor of Aquitaine, and she was the richest heiress in Europe. And he convinced her to buy up even more French lands to add to the English crown. Henry and his Plantagenet dynasty now owned nearly half of modern-day France. They spoke French, they mixed with French nobles, they were more often not in France than England. They were French. But this is where there's a catch, right? These lands, they weren't exactly owned by them. They were owned by the kings of France. Like any vassal, everyone had to make sure that they needed to kneel in front of the King of France and pay homage to the King of France, the Valois family. The kings of France really weren't in a position to make the English kings do this to them because the English kings were just a little bit too powerful. So they paid lip service to the king and continued on with their lives as normal. Now, like I said, this is where the actual problem lies, because over the years, the Valois used their powers to start taking back all of these English-held French lands when weaker Plantagenet kings sat on the English throne. In fact, by the time of our first warring king, Edward III, was born in 1312, most of the French lands had been reclaimed by the French crown. But the English still held one foothold in Gascony. As Edward III came of age in 1327, he was finally going to be the powerful king, except he wasn't. He was completely powerless. In an ancient version of Days of Our Lives, his mother's lover, Roger Mortimer, had taken the real power of the throne, but Edward was a leader of men, and at the age of 17, in 1330, he marched into Mortimer's castle, dragged him out at night, and sent him to the gallows, and he was hung for treason against his country. From here on out, Edward had decided that he and his court would be a shining example to Christendom, a throwback to chivalric imaginary age of King Arthur, where music, colour, tournaments, poetry, and everything amazing reigned. He ensured that he had his wealthy nobles around him, but the biggest part of his chivalric code was that the king would lead his nobles into war, gaining lands, wealth, and glory. With his nobles backing him up, he laid his crosshairs on his first target, the Scots, where he crushed them in battle. Now things were really looking up for Edward, but in 1337 he would become threatened when his whole world was turned on its head. The French came knocking. Philip VI of France was becoming more determined to gain the last Plantagenet English land of Gascony in France. Now Philip obviously had good claim to this land. He was the king after all. He also had a very strong army behind him, and he saw himself as a leader in Christendom. His country was one of the leading centers of culture and education. He saw himself as above the English kings. He thought only the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperors were his equal. The French nobles were the perfect examples of chivalry and wealth, whilst he saw the English nobles as scum. What Philip did was he made an alliance with the English foe. That old saying, "the enemy of my enemy is my friend," was really personified here, because he went straight to the Scots and he teamed up with them. He then confiscated the lands in Gascony away from England, and specifically Edward. And Edward tried to open up diplomatic relations with France to overcome this issue, but Philip wasn't having it. So Edward sailed over to France with his army, and he said he was going to defend his rights as the landowner. Now, why go to war over some land at the bottom of a country? Well, Philip knew exactly what he was doing when he took this land away from England. First of all, it was a personal insult to England's honour, and Edward's honour. It was also a threat to the English merchants, because England had two sources of wealth: the wine trade in Gascony and France, so they really wanted to keep the land, and the other was England made really high quality wool from their sheep, and it was the best in the world, and they traded it in Flanders, in modern-day Belgium. And the textile industry was one of the largest in Europe. Every year, thousands of kilograms of wool were sold at the densely populated cities of Flanders, and it filled the English coffers with gold. But here's the issue. The Count of Flanders was a subject of the French king. And King Philip told them, "You may not trade with the English," which meant that England would lose their two main sources of income, wine and wool. Now, there is a story, and I'm not too sure if it's true, but it kind of personifies what is going to happen next. One Friday in the market square of Ghent in Flanders, people were selling their wares, and above each marketplace was a flag to tell you where the product comes from. People noticed that there was a new flag that they hadn't seen before, the English lion courted with a royal French fleur-de-lis, when a young, energetic man stepped forward and he declared himself as King of England, Edward III, and he would take back his lands, and he would use his birthright through his mother to claim the French throne. Now, either way you look at it, France coasting England into war, or England declaring war, it's clear the clouds of war were gathering and stakes were high. England wanted their trade back. They wanted to be an important member of Christendom elite. They also wanted their lands back in France, and Edward wanted his honour back as a just king. But for France, the stakes were also high for them. They wanted a unified country, they wanted bragging rights in Christendom. And for Philippe, he wanted his birthright, his throne. Finally, by 1337, the war was on, and Edward was going to lead his country of around 4 million people against France, which was 5 times the size. It had the prestige of a superpower of the day. This is the ultimate underdog story. Fortunately for England, they had a warrior king on their throne, Edward. Now, Edward III was aggressive, he was confident, and he was brilliant, and he set a plan in motion. The first stage of the plan was to send a letter to the Pope, Clement VI, telling him that he didn't want war in England. He didn't want to ruin his villages and his towns, so it was best to pursue war in a different country, like, oh, I don't know, France maybe. Now, Edward and his army sailed over to France and set the real gears of war into motion. This was the start of the war that would last for generations. It would affect anyone who came near it and be remembered as one of the most brutal moments in human history. Now, Edward saw himself as a medieval knight, so he followed the chivalry strategy, which is a French word that I'm probably saying incorrectly, I apologize, but it meant raid on horseback. Now remember, Edward was pretty much French as they came, and he set a plan into motion. He called it fire and sword. What he did was he went into the French countryside with his army, and he would go around killing everyone, burning everything, and destroying anything that got in their way. This, of course, would cause economic issues for Philippe of France, as they were actually his lands being destroyed, but it would also show the French peasantry that Philip was weak. He couldn't protect them, and they should rather choose Edward to be their ruler and king instead. And Edward knew that eventually that he would have to turn and face the French might sooner or later. So what he did was he borrowed some money from the Italian banks, and he went to Louis IV, the Holy Roman Emperor, and he got him to back him up whenever this time came. In 1339, it seemed like that time was coming. It seemed like the French and English were going to face each other, and the Holy Roman Emperor was going to come save the English, except he didn't show, which meant that England's campaign hit a snare. He had spent so much money and had nothing to show for it. It meant that in 1340 he was in utter debt, forcing him to borrow more from Italy. In the last foothold of the English France, Gascony, the war was going so badly that the French even took control of the English Channel, making a blockade so no Englishman could get in or out, or anything for that matter. Things for England and for Edward were not looking good. Please find out what happens in part number 2. I really hope you enjoyed that. Thank you very much for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, the more you know.